And we're back, and we've got a very special guest this week. So a good friend of ours, good friend of Adir's, John Stensholt, the esteemed author of the Australian, the List, I think it's called these days. So is it true? So you obviously wrote the AFR Richest for many years, the doyen of wealth in this country.
BRW before then.
And BRW before that.
Might be showing my age.
Showing your age, exactly. You and Adir's age, obviously similar. I'm a bit younger.
I'm not going to comment on that this time. You say whatever you need to say to make yourself feel good about yourself.
So when you were famously poached by the Oz, so did Rupert rock up at your house with a big pile of cash? How did that process work?
No, I think it was just like a steak dinner. Adam. No,
Oh, really?
No, honestly, like it was pretty vanilla, like any other sort of job poaching. They made me an offer. Actually, the fin review matched it.
Oh,
so
really?
I could have stayed for this, for whatever they were offered me at the time. But I thought a new challenge.
Offer you
do
$5
something
million a
new.
year.
Correct. Yeah, that's right. Corporate jets and the other. And no, I figured new challenge, new thing. That was honestly that's what happened. And it's good to have a clean slate. You got to challenge yourself, and here I am. Yeah. 6 years later now.
It's a theory can I say one thing on the matching? My theory on employment is that it is very hard to keep an employee when you match an external offer for two reasons. One is they've kind of made up their mind to move already. And the second is a bit of what goes through the employee's head is, why didn't you just offer me what I was worth in the first place? Why did it take somebody else to make an offer to match it? So
I think in journalism we're used to that though, and I think you'll find actually that mostly that people will use that offer just to get a pay rise. So that's what happens internally.
That's interesting.
Quite a few people do.
Having done it himself before as well.
The list it's a fascinating thing to list, and I know you obviously done many of these. You've had, I remember famously, Adir once interviewed you talking about this stuff, and I was in the audience there. How important do you think the list is from a cultural perspective these days? I remember I started reading it in 1998. I've kept every single version of the list since then. I'm obsessed with it. Not so much for the sort of tales of wealth so much. And
19 what did you start? You speak very quickly, so I couldn't work out.
1998.
I didn't know if you mumbled because you speak too quickly or if you didn't want to show how old you really are.
I
didn't want people
18, I think, at the time. So I was pretty young.
So I thought you were 10 at the time.
Yeah,
you started
roughly
reading.
10. Roughly 10. How important culturally has this list become? Is it as relevant now as it was when you started the BRW list?
Oh, look, I mean, you don't want to over egg it and say, this is really important to people in a cost of living crisis and this sort of stuff. But I guess it is. There is some sort of an anthropological study to this, isn't there? If you go back over history and see how things have changed in business and how things have changed in Australian society. I mean, where wealth is created or where business is going is marked by a list like this, right? So, you can see obvious changes like that over time with the, less manufacturing and more technology. I mean, that's pretty obvious, right? But I think within that subset, you could see where, maybe underneath that is sort of e-commerce or people going overseas earlier. So there's a lot of trends I think you can take from a list like this that you can, show where business is going or where it's come from and where it's heading as well. So I think often, clearly these people are successful, right? And they're often ahead of trend, right? So that's probably one way you can see where business, society, all sorts of other sort of changes are heading.
How much work I know you always say that you spend all year writing this list and the main idea is tear it to shreds within 30 seconds of it running, which is true to an extent. But how much work, because it must be, if you've got public companies, easy. You can work out what the Atlassian guys are worth pretty quickly. But Gina Reinhart, for example, is largely all non-public, and you got her at 50 billion this year, the first Australian to ever hit 50 billion. How did you come up with the value? Like, what work is involved in this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, and by the way, I think 50 billion is probably, being pretty conservative.
Really?
It's incredible how profitable her company is, Hancock Prospecting, right? And if you compare it to, listed companies and use, profit, multiples on top of that, like it's actually pretty low. It's a staggering thing to say, right? But, like maybe if that was a listed entity, it could be worth a lot more.
Yeah.
Look, I would say, we publish in March, right? So, most of the print version, obviously with print deadlines, it's done a few weeks ago from now. I reckon probably, I always say after Melbourne Cup Day, I really start turning my attention to it.
Yeah.
And really, like while you're on the beach somewhere, in January, the Maldives or something like that. I didn't have a day off in January or February pretty much, most of December as well. Then we get into the business.
But you count work as
so
when you're on a private jet going to Trump's estate, that counts as work.
It has to be counted as work, right?
And so one of the anthropological... By the way, I don't go onto beaches. I do not lie on beaches.
Really?
Yeah,
I hate the sand.
We always have that conversation. Oh, we've got that in common.
Yeah,
every episode we've now found one thing to agree on. So we've got sand,
out of an hour and a half.
We've got sound for this one. So, John, when we talk about anthropological changes, like there's this big focus on women and women on the list, and So, one thing that's happened is that it seems you've started listing women that are married to men where traditionally the men would just be on the list. Now they're both appearing on the list, sometimes separately, sometimes together. And so, but there are also some changes in just the rise of wealthy women in society, it seems. And so what can you talk about with respect to that?
Oh, look, there's clearly more female entrepreneurs than there used to be, founders, right? There's clearly more female founders than there used to be. And you see that with, the Zimmerman sisters, in fashion, for example. But yeah, you're right. With another point of view, you see that with Nicola Forrest and Andrew Forrest now being listed together. So, I mean, look, that's clearly because...
So you list the Forest together, isn't they're separated?
Yeah, I mean, everything... Look, every part of their wealth is still held together, as well as just a small $50 million worth or so.
Yeah.
I think it is, or more than that, sorry, of Fortescue shares that are in her name. So,
Yeah.
look,
So really,
together for now, let's see what happens.
If you combine them, that'd be $74 billion and well ahead of Jamie.
No. If you combine... No, that number on there's combined. So if you split them in half, it's
that's quite confusing.
17 odd $billion each.
Shouldn't they be the same list? Shouldn't they be each joint too then? Because you've doubled the wealth.
No, well, that's a combined number.
But you've given them second and third spot.
No, but if you go to the
get
actual
Rupert
list,
on the line, tell
if
him
you go to the list, actually, if you turn over to the list, and then you go to the digital edition, and if you don't have a subscription, I'd suggest you take one out.
This is why you pay the big bucks.
Yeah, exactly right. Then you'll see that the numbers says combined.
I'm just looking at that.
And what about Scott Farquhar and Kim Jackson? Are they? Do you list them
Kim's
together, or do
no?
you,
Well, for the moment, I mean, given that all the Atlassian shares are in Scott's name,
you just list him.
List him at
the Fin Review
now,
lists her. Do you know that?
No, well, they do a rich women's list.
Yes,
that's now that list. I think you'll find will be different to their rich list.
Yeah,
right.
Will probably have just Scott Farquhar on it.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And so just to continue this topic, so do you think that? So what you're saying is that you think the rise, because I'm very fascinated about when you say that has got this anthropological significance. So maybe what we can see from this list, because it is a bit of a trailing indicator, like most people don't get this rich overnight. And so probably at some point over the last 10 or 15 years, there was this significant step up in the number of women that started to become founders or very senior in businesses that they co-founded maybe. And so that seems to be what this list is saying.
Yeah, it's a trend that's certainly increasing. I don't think it's increasing enough, by the way. So when you say there's more women on the list, absolutely there is. There's 33, but that's 33 out of 250, right?
Also, when you look at
that's not a huge amount.
But also 1998 when Adam started reading it, there was probably zero, right?
Correct.
No, but I think if you look at most of the women on the list, you've got Mel from Canberra, who clearly her own right.
Yeah.
I'm looking at other people. To get to a female, all the females I'm seeing have sort of inherited or, I'm just trying to find the top female who I'd argue be self-made.
Well, that's Mel, isn't it?
Well, it's Melanie, yeah. Well, you get down.
After Mel, I'm at 100 now. I can't. Imelda Roach at 107, who founded with a husband.
With a husband, but she was
the
driving force.
100%.
But she was the driving force of that,
right?
So yeah.
Who's the richest only female in here?
Well, you'd probably get down. You're testing my knowledge of the list now here after slaving away on it for months. But okay, let's take say the Zimmerman sisters for example. $800 odd million. I mean, I think that's clear. That's a clear indication of not only an industry that if you want to call fashion a traditionally female industry, probably not from an ownership point of view over time. But they clearly founded that themselves. And they have taken that business internationally as well. So there's a couple of trends there, isn't there? So female founders, but also taking it global. Whereas I think when you were looking back on it in 1998, Adam, that would have just been a domestic only list, right?
Well, that's true. The globalisation of everything has had a dramatic impact. I think the Zimmerman sisters are interesting because traditionally what you had was male-owned fashion businesses, like Solly Lou obviously had a fashion business and lots
selling
of other
to females, right?
Selling to females, but there were lots of designers that were female, and the Zimmerman sisters are these designers that have managed to also simultaneously be very capable at business and build their own design fashion empire. And I was shocked when I was reading about it how big it is outside Australia. I mean, this is an enormous business. So I think that's the difference, is the ability for founders who are passionate about products to then go and build these enormous brands globally is totally different in a globalized world, and definitely also in a world disconnected by the internet.
I think it's amazing. Like, for example, I mean, you would have seen this, Adam, I'm sure, and probably you, Adir. If you walk down the streets at Saint-Tropez, right, in France, there's a Zimmerman outlet, right?
Yeah.
That's where you guys hang out.
That's more about
I saw one in Florence. Now, I was on an educational tour with my daughter there, but you walk down the main street and all the, the amazing global brands, and there's a Zimmerman brand outlet as
Yeah,
well. It's incredible.
I think if you look through the list, I've just looked through the list there, and so there's a bunch of women who with their husbands or partners of umbrella. So that 100% true credit there. But if you look at the highest sole female on the list, who do you think it is? And taking out Gina, because I know most of it's her, but she didn't have a couple of billion. But
well.
Who do you think's the number one? Question for Adir: who's the number one self-made female on the list?
I've got no idea.
I would never have guessed this.
Yeah,
Robin Denham.
Robin, oh my god, that is
Elon's
fantastic.
largesse. I think she's 800 million, 822.
Just 827. I think she's just above the Zimmerman's, right? So,
she's what number is she? 176,
But,
822, and Zimmerman's at 812.
Presumably, essentially, all of her wealth beyond $50 million is from Tesla. Because she might have
all of it.
No, because she had some very senior jobs before that, and she would have been. She probably Telstra. I think Telstra's still going last I checked. Come
I'm
on.
not sure she made $50 million.
I like Robin, and I think she's very capable. And
of course you do. You like everyone.
Well, but let's say, that's not true.
Good Tesla shareholder.
Off air, I don't. But let's say the vast bulk of Robin's wealth is Tesla. It is
99.5%.
All right. It is quite amazing. This is what I have to put up with on this podcast. Now you're here to see. It's actually unbelievable. It's unbelievable.
I tune in to hear you, and all I hear is.
Well, I know that's not true because you'd never tune in to listen to me. But so that is quite remarkable. She's not really even an executive. She's basically made this tremendous wealth being a non-executive director. Okay, chair, but a chair is just a non-executive director. I mean, I wouldn't say just because, chairs, they're pretty amazing. But that has got to be the greatest wealth creation in the history of an Australian being a non-executive director of another business. It's got to be. I can't think of anything that would come even close to it, right?
Absolutely.
It's unbelievable.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, you're talking about what was, has been the most valuable company in the world, right? So, it's a very extreme example.
It was never the most valuable company.
One of the most, right? It's a very extreme example, isn't it, right? So, but you're right, I think, absolutely. But, we're not talking the biggest company on the ASX here. We're talking one of the biggest companies.
It's still a fraction of Atlassian, though. Like, you look at it, actually, no, that's not right. It's actually much bigger than Atlassian. So
her share is.
But if you look at, so we can say this, I think we can say this confidently, Robin Denholm has made more money as a non-executive director of any company than anybody else in the world.
Is it somewhat ironic that the Delaware Chancery
Is that right? You agree with that or not?
Oh, I'm not sure. There may well be other examples.
She was the chair of Tesla.
She'd be up there. I think she'd be up there.
And it rocketed in value.
I think your point is
non-Australians. There must be other examples of that.
No, but I think your point is probably right, and that there's plenty of direct. Like, if you're a director of Amazon, you probably made a heap of money. If you're a director of Berkshire, you made a heap. But she was they're investors. She wasn't an investor in Tesla. She got all her wealth through options.
And she was chair, and so chair is going to get much more. And also Tesla went through this phase where their non-executive directors, like everyone associated with the business, got a ton of options with the business. I mean, obviously that's been controversial now. And so I think, I stand by it. I think it'll be interesting to see whether we can find someone who has made more money as a non-executive director of a company than she has.
Well, I think the irony with her is, like, last week she was a couple of weeks ago, she was visually criticised by the Delaware Chancery Court for being basically inept in her role.
Well, I didn't like that at all. I thought that was terribly unfair.
Terribly unfair. This is the most senior corporate judge in the US. She knows what she's talking about.
Unfortunately, we're all just human beings, and I thought that was a very unfair criticism.
I thought it was the correct call. Anyway, a few other people on the list.
Who was the highest paid executive on the list that made their money as an executive in a company that wasn't theirs?
Highest paid or
highest highest on the list. Yeah,
that's a good question.
Well, you remember that you remember the days of like the Babcock and Browns and Macquarie. Well, not Macquarie's, but certainly Babcock and Brown. I remember at one stage there was about 7 or 8 people on the list.
Yeah, that's true.
MFS as
not
well.
Anymore.
The guy that's getting
that's probably not around. That's pre-GFC days, right? So
what about the guy that's getting 50 mil a year at Macquarie? Is he on your list?
No, but the cutoff is like 500 odd million, right? So
yeah,
pretty high cutoff these days.
90.
What do you do about
the cutoff increase? Is super interesting.
Yeah.
I remember, this is going to make me sound old. I actually genuinely remember when the cutoff was maybe $35 or $40 million.
I certainly remember 80
or
so.
something.
Yeah, less than 100.
And what do you do about capital gains tax factoring in? Because mere mortals like us, unfortunately, the government takes a lot of our money when we sell an asset. And so do you factor that in, or you just
I do try to factor that in.
You do?
Yeah. I mean, I think, there's a case-by-case basis. Some people have actually told me that, about the huge checks they've written out to the ATO in their time. They are eye-watering figures right now.
Yeah.
Some probably, pre that. I do try and take that into account. It's obviously a calculation that gets done in the background, right? Yep. And look, no one's going to tell me that, I paid $200 million in capital gains tax, but they certainly say, the first thing they say to you, I had to pay tax on that. So you've got to take something. And it would be a big sum to people like me.
Yep. All of these people that have held their shares from before 1987, there's no CGT payable for them when they sell their shares.
Absolutely.
Just unbelievable. I think New Zealand still has no CGT.
Right.
I think so.
Interesting.
Yeah.
We've talked about Satire a lot on the show. Controversial founder CEO Dean Mintz, is he on the list? And how much? And you just take the share market valuation. There's no editorial input. If Adam thinks his shares are overvalued by 98%, you say, well, Adam can go get stuffed. We care about the share price.
Oh, of course. I mean, that's a public figure. That's a public number that you have to take into account. Now, we rule it off. I mean, I have to rule it off, several weeks ago when there's a print deadline and I've got to, get everything. So it is a bit of a, time and, a particular time and place, right? So, yes, he's on the list. I mean,
what was he at?
So you take into account, what was he, like about 244 or something like that? I think it's about sort of 610, I think it was. You'd be able to tell me you've got it in front of you there. But
good memory.
I know, but like 250 figures to remember. My goodness me. No, so yeah, absolutely. So with someone like him, you've got to take into account that the share price at the time, right? So he's got his shares, but also the cash that he's accumulated over several years, I suppose. Now that's where
in terms of sell downs,
correct. So when he's sold down,
729,
he's sold down at float as well, right? So which is because it's pretty.
That was low at float.
It's pretty recent. Yeah, it's pretty recent. But I'm just thinking of other examples.
I think most of his wealth is current shares.
So if you take the current shares plus, what are we up to?
$337
million.
Yeah.
You take let's take 25% off that.
Yeah.
He's bought a mansion in Toorak in Melbourne as well. So you take off that, but that gives you an asset as well on the other side of the ledger, if that makes sense, and that will appreciate over time. So yeah.
I think one of the great things about this is you do try and speak to everyone on there. So you don't just make up a number. You'll try and speak to them. And I find there's two people who exist in this world: people who want to be higher, people who don't want to be listed at all and hate you, or not hate you, but just don't want to
tolerate at best.
Yeah, tolerate at best. What percentage is in each category?
Okay, yeah. All right. I mean, given the amount of time that I've been doing this, you do build up a bit of I think tolerance, I suppose. That I reckon probably maybe 80-85% would actually get back to you and just say, look, even if it's a thanks for letting me know, I mean, there's some a bit more funny than others about it, but some will be just, oh look, John, no comment. Others will actively engage and say, did you know about this? Did you know about that? What about this asset? What about that asset?
What percentage of people want to be up versus down?
There'd be more up that want to be up than
really?
Down. Absolutely. I mean, like when it's really obvious and you have to say, look, your share price is down 40%. You're going to have to go down, right? It's kind of like a grudging. Yeah. You're not going to be surprised to know there's a lot of egos involved with these people. These people are, pretty A-type personalities, really. They're founders, they're big people. They're big, big names around campus. They're very, very, very competitive, and I can tell you they definitely read this.
On a personal, I think it's great that you do the list and you do a great job of it. Obviously, I've told you there before, but I've also told you before. I could think of I'm nowhere near being on the list. I could think of nothing worse than being on a list like this. I just think being famous for how much money you've got is just like, yes, there is an ego element. Like personally, I had that ego element when I was young. Luckily, I kind of outgrew it. But there's that. But I'm
so sure about
that's
that.
That's massively offset on money. It is, but it's massively offset by just the parasites that are attracted to you when they see you having this much money. And surely the ATO must be calling you and asking you questions as a result of this list.
Oh, that's been a common complaint over time. When you talk to people on this, the ATO will talk. Well, the ATO will call me and go through my books. Well, my sort of response to that is, well, given that you're on the list, I reckon you've got enough money to pay for that, right? Like, I'm not going to feel sorry for you.
Do they call you? That's my question. Does the ATO call you and talking to you? They're not talking to you?
No. And if they were, I wouldn't tell you. Yeah.
No, exactly. But there's a lot of workings that are going on behind the list. Like, I reckon I think the ATO is smart and very heavily resourced and have got great matching data. But there are things that you know these businesses better than most of, let's say, the family members related to these rich people.
We used to say there used to be this now, whether it was sort of apocryphal or whatever you want to say, a bit of a myth that one of the biggest selling news agents for the BRW days was the one closest to whatever the ATO headquarters was. They'd go and buy a crate of magazines or whatever. Yeah, that's right.
The problem is that
now whether or not that's true or not, I don't know. But there is a little bit of a correlation between going on the list and then getting a big, ATO audit, a year or two later. I mean, supposedly,
If
right?
I was the ATO
I'm not sure I feel sorry for them though.
Yeah. No, listen, everyone has to pay their tax, right? But
Yeah.
if I was the ATO commissioner, I can tell you there is no doubt I would be having conversations with you, and Adam wouldn't like it because I'd pay for the lunch that I have with you. It would be a nice restaurant, and I put on the public purse. And Adam doesn't like anything on the public purse, but
Wouldn't that be nice Senate estimates then, wouldn't it?
but I would very much have a conversation with you because I honestly think that you know about people's sources of wealth better than anyone else, and the stuff they disclose to you voluntarily is going to be stuff the ATO has never even heard of before, I think.
Well, do take a little bit of cajoling, dear. I think that's all. I mean, if you think about it, I
there's
don't
a
think
lot-
anyone wants to be on the list. I think most
I reckon a lot of
people.
people want
You
to be
don't
on
think
this.
anyone wants to be on the list?
I think once they're on the list, that they're quite happy
Oh,
about
I
it. There's a bit of a difference
people
there.
are
I
on
think.
the list.
I mean, maybe there's an aspirational element of people that grow up and think,
I
want
literally
to
know
make it
people.
one day.
I literally know people, several people that have lobbied you to be on the list, and I know people that have lobbied me to convince
lobby
you not to put them on the list. We both know who we're talking about, and so there are people I think there are some people that really want to be on that list.
Absolutely.
Yeah, look, I think there's there is a cachet to being incredibly wealthy, and I think let's take someone like one of your favourite guys like Anthony Pratt, who I think that being Australia's richest person for a while there helped open doors for him with politicians, and I mean you've seen what happened with him and Donald Trump in America, but I think also here in Australia with prime ministers, it does give you some sort of cachet.
You see the richest person in the world, I should say, and the tussle between Musk and Bezos and Bernard is
That's mostly an
intense.
ego tussle, though, right? That's
I
mostly
think
an ego tussle.
with
100%
wealth,
ego tussle.
with wealth
At that
comes
level.
some power too, right? That you could wield to potentially, you could try to anyway.
I think the most important question here is how can we get Adir on the list? Like surely we can
I
sneak
would
him in at
never-
249.
I would never be. I'm so far from this list, and I would do everything to stay off the
I
list.
think
I'm
he's
gonna
closer.
lobby to
I think
get
he's
him on the
closer
list.
than people think.
It sounds like
nowhere-
those guys who want to get off the list. They should be on there.
I'm nowhere near
That's what
it.
the ATO crawling all over.
Just have to do a bit of cajoling.
I think that you really do a great job with it. So I think this is a public service. Now, it's easy for me to say that not being on the list because I'd be much
See how it goes next
more
year.
upset if I... No. Well, you know what? Nothing would make me happier. Well, that's actually not true. There are many things that would make me happier than being rich enough to be on the list, but I would certainly be happy to be rich enough to be on the list. I think I'd try and give that money away to stay off the list, but I tell you why I think it's a public service, because one of the things, I'm a bit of a banger on about Western civilization, and one of the things about Western civilization is that we don't have a society where all of the wealth is concentrated in a few people's hands, and all of the power goes on behind the scenes between rich people. And I think it is important that society in general knows who's collecting large chunks of money. I think it's especially true, capitalism, as we are in capitalist societies for longer, that machine starts polarizing wealth over time, and we have to reverse that if we want to have a nice society. So I do think this is a civic service to be putting together these lists.
Well, I certainly wish that they would give away more of their wealth. Now, if you do a philanthropy list and you balance that up against a rich list, there's, I know that not all, wealth is, a lot of wealth is on paper and it's not all liquid.
A lot of
to give
philanthropy is
away.
private as well.
Correct,
So.
that's right. So, but that's the interesting part that people, some people I know, a lot of people on that list would be more comfortable talking about their wealth and their philanthropy, right? Which is
problematic.
What does that suggest to you, right? So
Well,
I think it's a problematic thing.
The good thing about the US, I think, is philanthropy is much more expected in the US, whereas Australia is probably not to that, unfortunately, not to that level.
Yeah,
yet.
that's right. Now
Hopefully
we
get there.
have a bigger state over time and so on, so that that does a lot of the public service. Now it goes back to paying the amount of tax that you should probably pay, right? So I think there's some looming issues with that, but I mean, that's probably for what I'm going to have to do the list for my penance for the next 10, 15 years or so, right, to figure that out.
Are you shocked about how much richer Australia has gotten over the last 10 years?
Yeah, certainly over the last 10, 20 years, but I think that's the case that a lot of these entrepreneurs have been able to go global, right? So that's putting them in global terms, so rather than just having a domestic market to service that would have been the case back in the day. I mean, if you go through that, top 10, most of them would have, global exposure to business, right?
Atlassian,
even
Canva,
probably
Gina.
Correct.
Well, Gina's selling nothing in Australia.
Well, no, correct. So they're exporting, Pratt's
Anthony
over
Pratt,
in America,
yeah.
right? So there's
It probably comes down to trigger off where you can start.
Correct. That's probably one of the one, or Clive Palmer collecting the royalties. Mind you, that's off
that's
off
Asia.
a Chinese
That's China.
company, right?
Yeah,
So that's right. So yeah, you're right. Probably just
trigger
Harry,
Harry.
who's probably the
And
only
Frank Lowy,
domestic.
but even Frank Lowy is international now.
But even with that, Westfield was one of the first companies, Australian companies, to be really successful globally. So that's what's changed. I think. The internet's been amazing for that, clearly.
And if you were looking at the list, and based on the list, we're advising someone, if you want to be rich enough to get on this list, this is what you should go into if you're an Australian. Is it tech or is mining and property still and finance still the thing to do?
Clearly tech, I think. I mean, you could probably do
new
some
wealth.
sort of fintech, right?
Yeah.
But you've got to, you've got to be in tech, I think, and you've got to think about your market outside of, your city or your country straight away, right? I mean, clearly you've got to, that's, the world is your oyster in that regard, and clearly the internet, e-commerce, there's no barriers to that these days. Mining, look, I mean, this is one of the interesting things about mining, right? Most of the mines and the assets are already in the hands of who they'll be in for a long, long time. There's not many new mining entrepreneurs being created, right? Whereas tech, there's clearly, everyone's got ideas and everyone's founding companies, and there's just so much of that sort of groundswell of founder-led things. So that's probably where the difference is. And when they make their money, then they park it in property. So
exactly. It seems the new mining rich listers are people that took a speculative bet on a particular mine or a particular thesis.
Or they're mining services, or they're servicing, they're servicing the companies already there, right? Yeah,
But your tech point is a very good point.
Group, for example, is a new one. So
So your tech point's a good point, which is if you want to make $50 million, which is a ton of money, just to reiterate, then you can do that by having a business that sells to Australians and be domestic. But if you want to make $500 million, almost all of these, or maybe every one of them that is sitting on the rich list, is predominantly selling their technology to overseas markets. So I think that's a great point.
Their services into a global market, or at least a Asia Pacific market to start with, and then going beyond.
I think on that note, we've got to go to our next story. You've been incredible, John. The list is unbelievable again. Go out and buy yourself a copy of The Australian if you haven't bought one already, which I'm sure most of our listeners have. But you do an incredible job. We're super grateful for all the work you put in.
Subscribe to it. That's what you want to
say.
Subscribe to it.
And make sure you click on John's article, then subscribe so he gets the credit for it.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks, John, for coming in.